Is the problem that we need to have some methodological or ideological rectification, just get the ideas and methods right? Or do we need major structural changes in the institutions of higher education?
I can respond.
I would also like to, yeah.
Thank you to our global audience in attendance today or tonight, depending on your time zone. And thanks to tonight's or today's presenters on the overarching topic of how to teach in a culture war, October 7, anti-Semitism and the Academy. Up first tonight is David Penn, a professor in the Department of European Languages and Studies at UC Irvine and editor of the journal Telos. His talk is titled Rethinking Diversity in Higher Education. Our second speaker will be Olga Kirschbaum-Shirazki, co-founder and editor of the Tel Aviv Review of Books and a fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. Her talk is on another topic of great pedagogical and political interest, the necessity of the dialectic, the case of modern Jewish history. And finally, our esteemed respondent, I am especially pleased to say, is none other than John M. Ellis, a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of California, Santa Cruz, chair of the California Association of Scholars, and the author of 11 books, the most recent of which is called The Breakdown of Higher Education, How It Happened, the Damage It Does, and What Can Be Done. David Penn, the floor, the microphone, and the Zoom screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Gabi. I'm really honored to be here. Thanks to Mark Weiner and to Gabi Brahm for organizing this, and to the Telos-Paul Institute for sponsoring, and to its generous donors. So as we consider in this series of webinars the ways in which college students, teachers, and many politicians have been supporting Hamas's terrorism against Israel, it has become quickly clear that what is happening now is the symptom of a larger problem that has been growing within our educational system over many decades. In my remarks today, I'd like to describe this problem, some of its causes, and some possible strategies for reversing this deterioration. So let's begin with the problem, which has to do with the roles of diversity and homogeneity in both education and our political system. So the recent attempts by the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn to use the principle of free speech to defend student protests in support of Hamas and against Israel indicate that they see the university as a neutral place that should harbor all viewpoints. Unfortunately, this ideal of viewpoint diversity is undermined in the first place by the obvious lack of conservative voices on campus, voices who would represent roughly half of the American population. So the first problem is that when university administrators invoke the idea of diversity, they're not talking about such viewpoint diversity, but only diversity in terms of ethnicity and gender. Administratively defining diversity in these terms through their DEI programs has had two problematic consequences. First, DEI policies in creating special opportunities and preferences specifically for Blacks, Hispanics, and women promote the tendency to view people not as individuals, but as members of a group. Such an orientation reinforces the kind of prejudice that divides people by ethnic and gender groups. Moreover, because the rhetoric of diversity is used to favor particular groups based on their victim status, DEI programs promote the attitude that whites, Jews, and Asians should be seen as the oppressors. Consequently, while racist comments might be considered a form of bullying and harassment when carried out against Blacks, there seems to be a hesitancy to consider calls for genocide against Jews to be harassment. This double standard feeds into anti-Semitism, which traditionally has been built upon resentment against alleged Jewish power. Anti-Semitism has thus arisen as a direct result of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. The knee-jerk response of university DEI administrators to now include Jews as one of the groups to be protected by DEI programs only doubles down on the identity-based politics that have led us into this situation. In classifying people by their group affiliation rather than treating them as individuals, the methods of university DEI programs exacerbate rather than eliminate bigotry. While the stated affirmative action policies of DEI programs directly implement such bigoted thinking, the means of establishing these policies has also suppressed legitimate debate at colleges and universities. DEI programs have not just argued against, but demonized the idea of equal opportunity. In doing so, DEI advocates have attempted not to argue for their own position on how to eliminate racism, but to exclude all discussion of colorblind admissions and hiring procedures as racist ploys. Most obviously, arguments against DEI are being suppressed administratively through the DEI statements that have been established as a requirement for job applications and promotions in academia. Because applicants and employees are being asked to affirm their commitment to DEI policies as a condition of hiring and advancement, alternative viewpoints have been administratively defined as outside the realm of legitimate debate. As John McWhorter has pointed out, the charge of racism has become a way to exclude people and perspectives from discussions. And this mode of suppressing debate now pervades the university from administrators to faculty to students. The difficulty here, though, is not just that diversity of opinion is being suppressed. For the university and indeed liberal democracy to function, there must be limits on diversity of opinion. The key question is the way in which such limits must be set. The difference between free speech and academic freedom can eliminate the kinds of limits that are necessary. Free speech as a legal right might indeed protect speech calling for genocide, torture, or slavery. Academic freedom, however, has stricter limits, since it involves what the university would support as part of its mission of teaching and research. Limitations on academic freedom are easy to understand when we consider an area such as medical research, which clearly must be oriented around saving human lives. Academic freedom does not extend to allowing teaching and research that seeks to spread dangerous viruses, for instance. Similarly, the university should be able to prohibit both the promotion of a genocide and a research agenda on how to subvert liberal democracy. While academic freedom is meant to protect the teacher or researcher who promotes unpopular ideas about how to achieve a particular goal, it does not extend to protection of those who seek to undermine the goals themselves of the university. Such limits on academic freedom and thus on diversity are legitimate to the extent that liberal democracy itself requires a minimum level of homogeneity in order to endure. One of the clearest examples of this need for homogeneity was the undermining of Germany's Weimar Republic by the open disavowal of liberal democracy by both communists on the left and Nazis on the right. Nazis were able to gain power through electoral mechanisms in large part due to the lack of broad support for liberal democratic institutions. Today, the recent unrest at our colleges and universities in the wake of the Hamas attacks on Israelis has highlighted the importance of the role of our educational system in maintaining liberal democratic values. Student and faculty expressions of support for Hamas reveal that education is not just about individual free development and free speech, but also about the constraints that we seek to impose on such development by establishing values. In the 19th century, Johann Gottlieb Fichte attempted to balance freedom and constraint by imagining that individual free development would naturally lead to rational insights into the necessary constraints on development. But the intervening 200 years have shown that there is no guarantee of the rationality of such individual development, nor even a clear sense of what such rationality might mean. Rather, we have come to realize that the education process will always require a clear sense of the values that organize an educational project. The different value systems that have historically been used to organize education have generally been oriented around either religions or political ideologies. If we are committed to the preservation of liberal democracy, then we must organize our educational system around this goal. This goal defines our cultural past, not as a fixed inheritance, but as the prehistory of our aspirations for the future. That is, we look to the past with our values in mind in order to hold on to those aspects of the past that help us to understand how to realize our values in the present and the future. As a consequence, the development of an educational program for today requires a set of choices. First, about the texts that are most relevant for the development of liberal democratic values, and second, about the attitudes that we bring to those texts. Now, our current difficulties are a result of the push in the 1980s for a multicultural curriculum to replace the Western civilization curriculum that had been established during the Cold War. Multiculturalists criticized Western Civ for providing a parochial view of the world, in contrast to the supposedly expansive and cosmopolitan perspective of a multicultural curriculum that would include the perspectives within U.S. culture and from the rest of the world that had not been included previously. But the premise behind the multicultural curriculum was flawed because it assumed that the Western Civ curriculum was meant to provide a comprehensive view of the world, when in fact the point was to establish a particular perspective and method for viewing the world that was oriented around the values of a liberal democracy and the methodology of critical analysis. Developed in the course of the 20th century and gaining special significance during the Cold War, there is a clear hierarchy in the Western Civ curriculum and a sense of the importance of the values at stake in the educational project. The Western Civ curriculum explicitly taught such values as crucial to the defense of our republic against the various authoritarian ideologies that threatened it. By replacing the Western Civ curriculum with a multiculturalist one, faculty and administrators were undermining the liberal democratic values around which a college education was to be organized. The multiculturalist project focused explicitly on the perceived limitations on content of the Western Civ curriculum, arguing that this older curriculum had excluded large areas of content and was thus itself prejudiced and racist. The proposed remedy was to include this alternative cultural content in order to affirm texts and products produced by minorities, women, and in non-Western cultures. But by imposing an arbitrary standard on the curriculum based on the identity of people producing texts rather than the content of those texts, the multiculturalist approach undermined the idea that texts were to be chosen based on their contribution to our attempt to protect and expand liberal democratic values. Though the integration of writers such as Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois into our college curriculum has indeed been valuable, the point cannot be to affirm their work as such or as the work of Black writers, but to consider and critique their ideas in terms of the values of a liberal democracy. Unfortunately, however, the inclusion of such new content has been based on the principle of affirmation rather than critique as the mode of learning. If there was something to be corrected in the Western Civ curriculum, it was not its content, but its approach, which should not have been to develop an attitude toward culture solely of affirmation, but also of critique based on a set of shared values of equality, freedom, and support for our liberal democracy. In focusing on inclusion and affirmation of alternative texts, the multiculturalist curriculum threatened to undermine the principle of critical thinking in the approach to ideas and culture. The overall effect has been to replace a particular value system that privileges the teaching of liberal democratic values with an alternative value system that privileges people and cultures who have been excluded and victimized. But valuing those who are victims rather than valuing those whose own values are those that we share has had major consequences. The overall effect has been to shift the goals of higher education away from the promotion of liberal democracy and toward a set of goals that affirm the victim status as itself the basis of value. The challenge today will be to reestablish the primacy of liberal democratic values as the organizer of our educational curriculum, both in terms of content and approach. In the first place, this will require a recognition that the Marxist, Leninist, and post-colonialist approaches that divide the world into victims and victimizers is at odds with an education that promotes liberal democracy. Adherence to liberal democratic values and not victim status itself must remain the basis for judgments in our approach to the past and the present. Such an approach will determine the content and methods of a curriculum that combines freedom and constraint. We must constrain ourselves and thereby limit diversity to the extent that we affirm values of freedom and equality and reject opposing values. We must protect diversity and freedom to the extent that we allow space for critical perspectives in our common goal of supporting our shared values. But academic freedom cannot be extended to allow teachers and researchers to themselves determine the values to be promoted at the university. Promoting liberal democratic values has been and must continue to lie at the heart of the educational mission in the United States. While we must support the ability of students and faculty to voice their ideas about different ways of pursuing these values, we are not obliged to protect the academic freedom of those who directly oppose them. These values must override concerns about faculty autonomy because our educational institutions should serve the goals of their sponsors and not the interests of their faculty. The causes of our current problems point to the ways in which higher education can be revitalized. In the first place, the Supreme Court's Bakke decision established a race-based notion of diversity as an allowable way for university administrators to extend affirmative action in both policy and as dominant theoretical framework for understanding social issues. While the Supreme Court has corrected itself in the Students for Fair Admissions case, the administrative structures of the old regime are still in place at universities, and it will take pressure from legislators and other university sponsors to dismantle DEI administrative structures that have set in stone an affirmative action agenda. Because faculty and administrators have been complicit in this development, there will be no way to reform these structures without political pressure from the outside that must be applied by donors, boards of trustees, politicians, voters, and parents. Writers such as John Ellis have argued that universities can no longer be reformed from within, and that it will be necessary to dismantle their structures from outside, either through state legislatures or the founding of new institutions. However, a key issue at this point is a lack of faculty who would teach at such renewed institutions. Reform of higher education will involve the gradual recruitment and training of new scholars who are not part of the currently dominant paradigms of higher education. Here, there has been an intellectual failure on the right to counter the framing of questions and the theoretical models developed by left-wing academics. At present, the main conservative alternative to left-wing discourse has been a call to return to the classics of a Western civilization curriculum. While there is clearly a need to do this, this must be done in a way that responds adequately to the criticisms of the left that Western civilization was built upon the oppression and victimization of others. There is no need to deny such oppression. Instead, the goal should be, on the one hand, to recognize how such oppression has been necessary for the establishment of every culture, but also to focus on the values at stake. Rather than rate cultures based on their level of victimization, we should compare ideas and cultures based on the types of values that they affirm. Liberal democracy must be based on exclusions, just as any political form. The challenge is to be able to compare liberal democracy with other forms in order to understand its unique strengths and weaknesses. A key aspect of left-wing theories has been the tendency derived from Rousseau and Marx to treat the people themselves as inherently good and self-identical. It is this assumption that leads to protests in favor of Hamas, who as victims are assumed to be automatically an innocent and oppressed people. Against this assumption, the goal should be to explore the way in which the people cannot be a people without being constituted through a representation. This process of representing the people is the fundamental political act, and the various ways of representing the people can be compared in terms of their consequences. A new approach would focus on this process of representation as both constitutive of the people and responsive to popular perceptions and intuitions. Unfortunately, such thinking is being hindered by academic disciplines that have become echo chambers in which diversity of thinking has been stifled by the peer review process. The problem here is that intellectual life has been constrained by the ways in which academic disciplines have established the dominant paradigms for thinking. While the peer review process is designed to provide objective judgments on the quality of work, in practice, the effect of the process has been to enforce a particular value system that conforms to a left-wing discourse premised on an anti-Western attitude. Unfortunately, most professional associations have been captured by such a value orientation, and work that does not conform to such values will have a difficult time receiving an adequate appraisal. Moreover, the fragmentation of the curriculum due to multiculturalism has also contributed to a hyper-specialization that allows different researchers to focus on their own corners of research, thus relieving them of the need to justify their work as long as they conform to the same left-wing pieties. What can be done? In addition to developing new theoretical paradigms to counter left-wing discourse, it will be necessary to reestablish narrower canons for the curriculum on campus that can reorient discussions around common topics, leading to real debates rather than succumbing to the multiculturalist attempt to diffuse such confrontations by creating hyper-specialization. Promoting real debate should also be the goal in engaging with left-wing opinions and perspectives at professional meetings and in academic journals. While it may be necessary to establish new journals, it will also be crucial to transform existing institutions. Rather than retreating from organizations like the Modern Language Association, the American Historical Association, or the American Studies Association, conservative academics need to show up and organize in order to develop new paradigms for research and create forums in which their perspectives can be heard. The current struggle at our colleges and universities is about the fundamental values around which they should be organized. Students who support genocide are just the symptom of a fundamental problem of values pervading all levels of the academic community. The subversion of the basic principles of liberal democracy has been progressing for decades at our colleges and universities and is now reaching into our primary and secondary schools by way of teacher training. The move toward multiculturalism has established and promoted faculty who explicitly oppose the United States and its values in favor of an identity politics that is coupled with a Marxist-Leninist value system. The key to opposing these tendencies is to understand that liberal democracy presumes a culture of open debate and critical thinking that is based on a shared commitment to the values of individual freedom, equal opportunity, and democratic decision-making. A new generation of students and scholars needs to be shown that such values can and should form the basis of teaching and research for the future. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Professor Pan, for those incisive, stimulating remarks, which are so pertinent to the moment that we find ourselves in. I look forward to the discussion of these things which you've brought up for us. Next in our series of speakers tonight is Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Shirazki.
So thank you so much for having me. I'll jump right in. In 1997, I had the pleasure of auditing a class by the author, one of the authors of this book, How to Study History, Richard Schneider. And in this class, he introduced me to sort of a basic foundational concept in history, that there is a dialectic in the study of history between the sources or evidence for facts and the theories and worldviews and values that inform how we understand these facts and put them together. So that there's a continuing push and pull between evidence and sources and between values and ideas and theories. And so that, in being introduced as such a young, quite frankly, still a teenager at that point to this idea, it remained with me for the rest of my studies. And so in this talk, what I want to discuss a little bit is just, I think, generally how I see the study of history, how it occurs today, and then what are the problems and where are the areas where there seems to be a weakening of this dialectic and what we can do about it. So I'm a firm believer that the study of history is something that all human beings practice every day. We're all involved in the question of finding out what the facts were, who stole my purse, deciding whether a source has any validity or not, or it can be trustworthy. So history is something that has a value for every citizen and every person. And I think that most forms of history fall into what I'm going to call 4 different modes. There's the mode of inquiry. There's who stole my purse? There's the mode of identity, the history I tell myself, about myself, or I tell others about myself. There's history as discovery, the history of you, another person, the person you're dating, the person who's your friend. And what I call history is critique. Maybe it might start with the history of my bad family. So this kind of human practice that we have in our everyday life, I think, translates also, these modes exist among professional historians. And within these modes, then we have the introduction of worldviews and theories. So, history as inquiry, a typical example: why did the crash of 1929 happen? History as identity. These are the classic histories of such and such a people, or now more recently, such and such a group. The history of modern feminism, written by people who are sort of aligned with the views of that movement. History as discovery is often something we find in more ancient histories, where there's more interest in just discovering the culture, how people operate. And then history as critique, we see very commonly in the histories of a certain political movement or a certain state, etc., especially by people whose values are contrary to that. So these are the kind of different modalities. And I feel like in my studies as an undergraduate and a graduate, I kind of it came at a moment where the dialectic, this historical dialectic, as a student, one could live it by the different faculty and the different approaches. That is to say that, we would have faculty who might be teaching a history on a topic where they were aligned, and so it was more history as identity. We might have faculty who were teaching it as critique. And if it was inquiry, we'd have faculty who were really bringing in all the social scientific theories that were opening up the types of questions that were being asked. So I had the privilege of learning with one of the great founders of environmental history. And the environmental historians really showed us how changes in ecology technology or changes in land, even such a simple thing as the introduction of animals had profound economic and political consequences. And some of these, of course, were not even planned. I studied with some of the early cultural historians who did microhistory, or who brought us to common people through the use of court cases and sources. So this moment, and so I through a wonderful mentorship of Professor Schneider, I really lived this dialectic, and I could see how historical teaching, how it was operating, and the so-called literary turn really brought to students of my generation understanding of the importance of philology, the use of words changing over time. And I think the historical discipline benefited greatly from this. And also, as I moved into the field of modern history, I was still getting taught by professors who would teach histories, for example, of the Cold War, or histories of anti-Semitism that brought people with different values. So it wasn't simply that the social sciences and social scientific theories had influenced the questions asked, but the historical research had also sort of then dialectically impacted how we understand social scientific theories, or in some cases questioned the validity of certain theories. Marxism being a case in point, and not only by people who were against Marxism, but even by people who were in favor of Marxism, but were or like the Frankfurt School, but who considered that classic Marxism was inadequate. So that dialectic was clearly something that I had experienced. And so the question is whether this dialectic is still in play. Are we still getting the same richness of theories that are influencing the questions that are being asked? Are we still getting an interplay of values that are defining whether the history is written more along the lines of identity or more along the lines of critique? And are they being read one against the other or not? Now, having not done a formal empirical study of all of the history curricula in the field of Jewish history, or of the texts being published in the publication houses in the last 10 years, which would really be necessary to say, you know, where things are truly at. Rather than saying that everything has gone to pot, what I would say is more that what are the things that are necessary to maintain a dialectic in the field of Jewish history, particularly in the wake of what are now established tendencies in other departments to view Zionism as a terrible ideology akin to racism, or perhaps even akin to Nazism. So what is necessary in the field of Jewish history? So I would say that like in other fields, that there needs to be, first of all, transparency about history itself, right? That there are these different modes, that there are historians who write about a topic that they align with, and they are historians who write primarily in critique of a topic based on their viewpoints. And there needs to be transparency about that. Transparency about the impact of different theories on the questions that are asked for historians. And with this transparency, then the effort being made on the part of historians in the academy, perhaps not in their research, but at least in their teaching, in bringing the transparency about the modes, the transparency about the worldviews, and the transparency about the theories that are informing their questions into conversation. I know this is a jargony word, the word conversation, but I think it's an important one. And then with that, one can maintain the dialectic. That is to say that one does not start confusing a heuristic category with reality. One does not start confusing the theory with the history itself, but rather these things remain in tension. So in the case of Jewish history, where there seems to, this would mean in practice, for example, if one took the history of Zionism, that we would be reading classic histories of Zionism written by Zionist scholars alongside, so that are in the vein of identity, alongside histories that are more critical. We would also be looking and expanding. I could give an example: expanding the chronology, expanding the language. One of the challenge of Jewish history is that because the Jewish diaspora was sort of spread out both geographically and chronologically, there's a challenge of languages. So to give the example of Zionism, there's now been some revising of the chronology of modern Zionism. So by historians saying that, in fact, modern Zionism appears first in the Ottoman realm, and not rather in Russia or in Central Europe. And so reading the scholars who view modern Zionism coming from there, in conversation with scholars who view modern Zionism coming from Central Europe, would be one of the ways, again, to maintain this dialectic. Another place, for example, where we see where we can maintain dialectics is on the question of emancipation. There are many scholars, or it seems to be scholars who favor the diaspora, who favor a certain kind of liberal Judaism over traditionalism, tend to write in a certain vein about the history of emancipation. And so in order to maintain the dialectic, we need to bring together scholars in writing that have different approaches to emancipation. A classic history of the Jews of modern France by Paula Hyman could be, for example, read in relation to history by Todd Edelman of radical assimilation and conversion in the period of emancipation. And finally, when we look at, for example, the issue of the paradigm of settler colonialism, and with that, I think I will end. I think my time is coming up. Settler colonialism as a paradigm for Zionism is one that has been critiqued very often, but not all scholars have really come up with an alternative. What would be an alternative comparison or paradigm? So in 2 articles that I wrote for Tel Aviv Books, I suggested, just as historians are increasingly seeing the Ottoman Empire as the locus of the beginning of Zionism, why not look at the other nationalities and other national liberation movements in the Ottoman Empire as the point of comparison for Zionism, rather than settler colonialism as coming from Australia or Canada or the rest of it. So these are just examples how, with transparency, with openness, with maintaining this dialectic between the sources and values and theories, that I hope at least that's a program for historians, giving people the skills that really I think the program of history study should give to students, is the ability to judge the quality of evidence, the reliability of source, and to come up with their own values and develop their own values in relation to life itself.
Thank you, Dr. Kirschbaum-Shirazki, for those stimulating, thought-provoking remarks, which we'll have time to discuss shortly after our respondent, who's up next, John Ellis.
Well, let me take David's paper first. I think David's absolutely right to put the strong emphasis on the fact that all of our criticisms of the degradation of academia at bottom are about this attack on our way of life. That's the fundamental issue involved. I think it's also the issue that's underlying the anti-Israel and anti-Semitism issue on campus too. We have to face the fact that radical leftists hate this way of life that we have, because its success proves that Marxism is in fact nonsense. I mean, basically, the way of life we have is based on a system that is the antithesis of Marxism. It works brilliantly. Marxists are very angry about the fact that it works so brilliantly, and they're very anti-America. They're anti-Israel for the same reason, that Israel is in many ways like America. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Marxists could tell themselves that Marxism hadn't been really properly implemented. But the one thing they couldn't, it was much harder for them to swallow the fact that a country like America, which didn't even exist a couple of hundred years ago, and had about 1/3 the population of countries like India and China, had within just a very short time become the most dominant country in the world, the most prosperous, arguably the happiest, I think, and certainly the most powerful. That's a very hard thing to swallow when, in other words, when the system that is the opposite of the one that you espouse comes up, with a fantastic level of success. No wonder they hate us so much for that. But where I don't follow David is his suggestion we limit the academic freedom of those Marxists. Now, we thrive on the marketplace of ideas. They don't. They fear it. Now, I have no problem with Marxists on campus speaking up and saying whatever they wanted to say. What I have a problem with is when they make sure that there's nobody else on campus except Marxists, so that there's nothing to compare what they say to what is being said elsewhere. The fact that they feel a compulsion to populate the campus with only people like themselves tells you very clearly something you need to know, which is that they fear the marketplace of ideas. They know they can't survive the marketplace of ideas. And what we have to do is not limit their freedom, just expose them to the marketplace of ideas where they will go down very, very quickly. And they know that. That's why they shape the campuses the way they do. What happens in the marketplace of ideas is they can't escape from the tests that all ideas have to face. So they'd be forced to discuss the pros and cons of their ideas, the pros and cons of competing ideas. They'd be forced to do that because while they're talking in one way in one classroom, in the next classroom, somebody else is espousing a different set of ideas. Students are going to compare them, and they can't avoid getting involved in that comparison, and they won't survive. And they won't survive because they're not academic scholars, they're political operatives. So they're not very good at comparing the pros and cons of their ideas to other people's ideas. They soon get shown as people that are simply people are recruiters for political ideas. They're just not good as analysis. So they pretty soon show up as incompetent, as analysts, as academics, that is. And what you do with people who show themselves up as incompetent, well, what any employer does, you fire them because they're not up to the job. And that's the way you deal, it seems to me, with the Marxists. If you ever got the universities back to good shape again, but if you did, you wouldn't have to limit what they say. Let them speak up. They'll destroy themselves very quickly. So the point is not to take anyone's academic freedom away, but to give it to them, let them run with it, and let them destroy themselves. So what we really need then is to just undo the monopoly of ideas that they've created, and that'll be sufficient to do what we need to do. Now, there's one other point that I diverge with David, but not with David specifically, with everybody else, I think. I don't like calling the way of life we're talking about Western civilization. To be sure, it's heavily involved in Western civilization. But for example, this all starts off with a group of people who are not Western, beginning the process of civilizing the world with the Jewish Bible. I mean, that's basically the Jews were not located in the West. And they, it seems to me, begin the process of creating modern life. To be sure, it's picked up and extended by lots of other groups, many of them in the West. In India, for example, I mean, if you ask the question, who wrote the first grammar of a language? That's a central aspect of Western scholarship, what we call Western scholarship. Well, the first grammar of a language was of Sanskrit by Panini, well before the turn of the millennium. You can't keep calling it Western civilization when so many strands have come from other places. Gunpowder is a basic thing about Western life. An awful lot of Western life is dependent on that. It came from China. So we're much better off talking not about Western civilization, even though it's dominated by Western civilization. We're better off talking about modern life. And if you talk about modern life, the development of modern life, and you have a course in the development of modern life, you can't then have people coming to you and saying, oh, you're neglecting American Indians, or you're neglecting China. The answer to that will be, well, we're talking about the development of modern life, and those people that were central in the development of that life will be obviously the subject of the course. The people that were peripheral to it will not be part of the course. So you're not then subject, as you do if you call it Western civilization, you're not subject to the charge of parochialism because you have a standard of relevance. Now to go on to Olga's paper, I don't know, engaging in theories of history, it's going to take us a long way off the subject of what's going on in Israel. So I won't do much with that. I mean, there's been a huge amount written on historiography over the years. Lots of it is wonderful stuff. Some of it is hot air. But let me just say a few words where I think Israel now stands. I mean, I think that if you go back to the period before English settlement in North America, you got a purely tribal situation among American Indian tribes. And if one tribe wanted the land of another, which was happening very, very frequently, a tribe coveted the land occupied by another tribe. The way in which they dealt with that situation was very simple: extermination. I mean, you know, if you wanted a reliable occupation of somebody else's land, kill them off. The English settlers slowly developed a civilization in North America that didn't operate that way, and everybody was on the whole much better for it. Where I think Israel is that it faces a tribal situation of the kind that existed pre-1500 in North America and in most of the rest of the world, in fact. The key to it is that Arabs want that land. I think the theories like settler colonialism and so on, their validity is one issue. I don't think they're at all valid. But the point is that they are sort of secondary. They are excuses. The real motivation here is basically primitive tribalism. One tribe has land, the other tribe wants it, and it would kill the other one off to get it if it could. Now, that being the case, I mean, you can soon see that what's the warfare, the ideological warfare being waged, is not on those terms, but it is a smokescreen. I mean, the objection to a genocide in Gaza, the objection to treatment of civilians in Gaza, contrasts very sharply with the real tribalist warfare that is being waged on Israel by Hamas. And of course, that tribalist warfare has no room for ideas like genocide, which it's quite happy to commit. So the protest against genocide is completely inconsistent with what is really happening on the ground. The protest against decent modern treatment of civilian, innocent, so-called innocent civilians, it's completely inconsistent with the medieval tribalism that is really motivating what's going on. So I think the best thing that Israel could do right now is just welcome these words, genocide and innocent civilians, and ask the other side to talk more about them. Are they really saying then that they object to genocide? Isn't that a nice idea? We welcome that. Please speak up some more about genocide. Tell us how you hate genocide. We'd welcome you saying that. And tell us what you think about the harm, the brutality of harming innocent civilians. We'd love to hear Hamas speak up. Just tell us what you think about harming innocent civilians and why that's so wrong in Gaza and why genocide is so wrong in Gaza. And then what's left of what the Palestinians are trying to do.
Thank you, John. And it's now time for discussion. Perhaps we should start by asking, maybe I should ask if Professor Pan or Dr. Shirazki would like to respond to Dr. Ellis in
Sure.
any way. And then we've got some questions in the queue.
Sure, I can respond.
I would also like to, yeah.
David and then Olga, and then questions from the queue.
Yeah, so let me clarify a little bit what I mean about limiting academic freedom. I gave the example of researchers, medical researchers, that you wouldn't hire somebody that would be trying to develop dangerous viruses to spread all over the world, right? And I think we can use that same standard. I mean, what I'm talking about is not so much firing people or limiting discussion, but really about what are the general educational goals we have, and how are we going to write job descriptions? What kinds of jobs are we going to be writing? What kind of people do we want to be employing? And here, I mean, I think that it's legitimate to say, oh, if we want a literary scholar, we want a literary scholar that's interested in certain problems, certain issues, and not in other problems and other issues that we don't think really support the overall mission and goals of the university within a liberal democracy. I guess I just want to sort of clarify somewhat what I do mean about limiting academic freedom, in the sense that it's something that we're always doing all the time in the sense of what types of questions, what kinds of problems we're hiring in to address and teach. And that should be something that we should really be much more cognizant of in the future, because at the present, if you look at hiring ads, I mean, I'm in literature, and the types of professors they're looking for are really oriented around this whole DEI agenda, and that's what I think really needs to be changed. Thanks, though. Thanks for the critique. And I guess you mentioned the point about Western civilization. I totally agree with you. I mean,
yeah, I think you might. Yeah.
Yes, I mean it's clearly we're not trying to exclude certain parts of the world. What I think we do need to do is just think through. I mean, I think we do clearly have a liberal democracy that we want to protect and defend. And we want a curriculum that's oriented around that idea. I think Western civilization has been kind of, I mean, I use that as the kind of way in which that idea was defended back in, like, say, in the 50s and the 60s. And yeah, I mean, modern culture and society, maybe, but maybe there's another way of understanding that. But I do think it has to do with a certain tradition that obviously includes inputs from all sorts of traditions. But there's certainly a kind of tradition in the West that has led to the development of liberal democracy. It's not limited to the West, but it's something that I think we need to focus on.
Thanks, David, for that clarification. As I throw it over to Olga, I just wanted to throw in, I like very much this idea of teaching about modern life myself. And as John notes, Western civilization isn't exactly Western in its roots. Thank you. Maybe the question isn't so much Western civilization or Marxism, but civilization or barbarism, as someone once said. Olga, you have some thoughts I can see to add.
No, so I just wanted to respond to this notion of marketplace of ideas. I think the reason I took 10 minutes to go over, even in a brief and simplified form, the basics of historiography is that that's part of what creates the marketplace of ideas. If we have historians doing history differently, then and there's a dialectic, not just between the data and the ways of approaching it, but between the different historians, then students are enriched in that way, and it teaches them how to operate with ideas as a marketplace rather than indoctrination. So I think the field of history is the omnivore's field. It's the field with philosophy, of all the different fields coming together. So it's a great place to do that. So that's why I thought it was important to mention that. And then in relation to the struggles that we face today, there's a tendency to, also in hiring, but you can see it also in some of the materials that are published, to stick to certain theories and to write the history in terms of theory. So I'm just outlining the importance of having this tension theoretically in terms of worldviews, etc. And then, we'll see what wins out. And in relation to your idea of modern life, I mean, I think that today, and this is true with the study of history, but that we can pick and choose from lots of cultures, and that really modern life is a synthesis. It has certain bases and certain strands, but we've taken wisdom from various places. And this has, by the way, a Jewish basis. The idea is that wisdom from all the nations should be learned, that the values should be of the Torah, but that all the nations have wisdom to bring together. So I would add, or even to your idea of modern life, that our modern life maybe isn't yet as good as we want it, that if we are open to learning and we are vigorous in this marketplace of ideas, that we might even make it better than we have it now. I mean, I'm someone who thinks I think that could be quite big improvements even in the United States and in Israel and around the world. There are many good things that are worth preserving and other things that could be improved. So that's my response to Professor Ellis.
Olga, we have a question directed at you here in the chat. U.S. universities have clear pathologies. Could you talk about how Israeli universities may be similar or different?
Well, if we go to the study of Jewish history, so there's a tendency, there has been recently, and with the so-called new historians, to move away from what I call an identity view of history. So historians who are themselves Zionists and who present a history, it's not that they're unprofessional, they look at the sources, but they present a history of Zionism that values Zionism as a national movement and the accomplishments of the Zionist movement, towards history as critique in my different modes, where the history is mainly a critique of Zionist ideology and Zionist practices. And that's been happening across the board in Israeli universities. It's not everywhere, and there are countervailing voices. And that's in the talk, what I tried to suggest is that it's really essential, and there I echo Professor Ellis, that we just maintain people who are operating in the different modes, operating with different worldviews, so that we maintain this marketplace of ideas. And so there has been, it seems to me, again, I don't have an empirical study in front of me of the syllabi and the publications of all the faculty, but there is a feeling that things are moving in that direction. And so we have, I think, historians and people have the obligation to ask and to demand, and here I echo Professor Penn, that at the institutional level, that we have clear standards for our universities. So for me, in the field of history, there needs to be the clear standard of having these different modes represented, different historical theories, diversity in terms of time periods and frameworks, and putting historians who have a different approach in conversation, in syllabi, if not in the research of the scholars itself, at least in the teaching.
We've got more questions in the queue. In the interest of time, let me pose a question to all three of you. Is the problem that we need to have some methodological or ideological rectification, just get the ideas and methods right? Or do we need major structural changes in the institutions of higher education, such as modifying hiring practices, defunding politicized humanities departments, building up trade schools as an alternative to liberal education colleges? What do you think about this question of getting the ideas right versus structural changes? Folks, it's a question put to all of you by one of our astute audience members.
So yes, I agree with some of those changes. I mean, I think one of the basic issues really is the fact that that all of these university structures have been, I think, kind of in a sense captured by a kind of perspective, this DEI / kind of I guess left-wing perspective, And they are kind of running the universities as if that is the mission of the universities, is to promote and kind of promulgate that perspective and to limit research to research that somehow supports that perspective. And so I think that's the fundamental problem. And so yes, we need to I mean, in some sense, it does have to happen through new institutions, in a sense, right? But not only new institutions. It really is about reforming the ones we have, and it is about kind of putting pressure. And it has to, I think, ultimately, I think John Ellis is right in his book that it has to come from outside to a certain extent. Of saying, well, look, we don't want these DEI policies, or they shouldn't be set in stone as administrative policies. They can, maybe people can argue for them, but rather right now, they really have been integrated into the very, kind of bureaucratic structure of the university. But not only that, they've set the kind of, I guess, ideological agenda for hiring, for teaching, for promotion. So yes, that all has to change. And what I'm proposing is saying, well, is that rather than having DEI as the kind of ultimate mission of the university, is really to return to this idea. Well, the university should be a part of the essential part of the institutions that support liberal democracy. And what does that mean? And think through what that might mean, and try and make an effort to align our universities around that goal. Well, I'll stop there right now, but we can talk about more in detail what that might mean.
The fundamental fact about universities that you've got to change is that they are staffed by hard left activists, and those people are in the controlling majority. Until that changes, nothing changes. DEI is a manifestation of the power of those people. They have the power to shape the administration the way they want it. But getting rid of DEI is not the same as getting rid of the radicals who control the campuses. All you're getting rid of is one particular thing they managed to do.
Mm.
But until you break the stranglehold of the radical left faculty, you've really not made progress that is going to get you very far. There are two ways I can see of breaking that stranglehold. One is state universities, which are funded by state legislatures. State legislatures and governors could say to a particular state university, we're imposing a new president. We're giving him a mandate to reform you, so that there is genuine political and ideological diversity on the faculty, and you better accept it or you don't get any money from us. Now, that is virtually beginning to happen in Florida, beginnings of it anyway. But it's extraordinarily difficult, even in strongly Republican states. I mean, a strongly Republican legislature like Idaho, for example, there's the voting strength there to do that, if Republicans could get their act together. But there's an extraordinary reluctance to get hold of a university and shake it and tell it to shape up. That seems to be, for many state legislatures, it's almost sacrilege to do it. But the only other way than this, and that only works with state legislatures in red states. The only other way is for the public to wise up. I mean, public is shelling out vast sums of money for tuition. I mean, this year's increase is extraordinary. Many institutions now charging $95,000 a year. But when the public wakes up to the fact that this is a waste of money, that kids are not getting educated decently, and it's a waste of 4 years of the kids' lives, then hopefully at some point enrollment will start to crash, and then the institutions will fold, and those institutions will then create the space where you can rebuild the campuses by hiring new people. As you were saying, David, finding those people is going to be difficult. Although I think there are probably more people hiding on the existing campuses than we think. people who know there's a controlling majority against them, and so shut up and hide. So I'm hopeful there's enough of those people, not that they're morally, wonderful, they're somewhat cowardly, but they could nevertheless take part in reform universities. But short of that, short of breaking the hold of the radical faculty, I don't think you've achieved anything by small-scale reforms, even though I'm in favor of those small-scale reforms. I'm in favor of abolishing DEI, but I don't think it solves the fundamental problem.
Yeah, I agree with that. What I think, though, is that the DEI problem is really just it's another aspect of the same kind of capture by the radical left. It's just they've been able to extend that control into the university administration, and that's why I really emphasize this idea of conservatives or just people that support liberal democracy really engaging with these institutions now. I mean, on kind of the local departmental level, but also in professional organizations. Because really, what I've seen in the professional associations, certainly in literature, is that they've really been taken over by a certain perspective, and nobody is willing to speak up. Where they're perfectly good opportunities to do this and to present alternative perspectives. But I just think conservatives have just retreated from those organizations. You think about the Modern Language Association. I was just at the American Comparative Literature Association conference, and it's really just it's just a very one-sided affair, right? But it only takes one person to stand up and say something to all of a sudden change the whole atmosphere in the room, in a sense, right? So that's what I think people need to do, is to be standing up and saying things. But also, I mean, I think there is a kind of intellectual problem of we haven't really been able to develop, or people haven't been publishing kind of alternative approaches, because the issue really right now is that research has, in the humanities and social sciences, it's been, judged based on this kind of what you call, I don't know what you call it, this leftist DEI agenda. And so because that has become the standard of judgment, that's really, excluded lots of other voices. I mean, I guess you wanted to found new journals, but you really want to somehow, be trying to publish in the main professional journals as well with alternative ideas. And somehow this has been a problem. The alternative ideas have not really been able to be developed either. So that's what we really need to work on, because it is, I think, an intellectual problem too.
In the interest of time, I'm just going to insert another question, and those who have things to say to this topic, feel free to incorporate them. I'm trying to mix in the voices here that we have on the chat. Don't hold back what you have to say, but I want to add Dr. Nellie Cooper, a distinguished professor of French literature at Northern Michigan University, asks something related to what you're already talking about. How should we expect the beneficial changes you suggest when the pressure from liberal youth, students, precludes these changes with violent opposition, influencing even the President of the United States in modifying his position toward Israel? I remember when the students were the ones who wanted more free speech, but I also remember recent days in which they're the ones who demand less.
Are they a majority? Surely not. The demonstrations are upsetting and horrible, but they're not huge.
I want to respond to this question and to the previous one. I think that just spreading the idea, including on such areas as social media, that one becomes, for lack of a better term, stupider when one doesn't know what the other side has to say about our ideas, meaning that there's nothing is gained by not having debate. And so encouraging debate and competition, and the importance of that within the university and with people, and how much is gained by that. I mean, I think that's really, really essential promoting that idea, to encourage people then afterwards to do whatever necessary institutional changes or within the university. And then I think really the outline of the discipline. I mean, it used to be that a history department was varied chronologically, was varied in terms of approaches, and was varied in terms of viewpoints. I mean, that's why I mentioned these things in my chapter. There was a moment where you could count on most history departments having that variety. So even being clear with each discipline on what variety would look like on these different levels is very important. And then I think I want to say, I mean, I'm not so much in the world of DEI in the United States, but I think that the tragedy also, what you're describing, though I think that left-wing perspectives should absolutely be present in the university. In fact, that our modern world has benefited from the synthesis and clash of left and right tremendously. But I think that also the very populations who have been underrepresented and who have something to offer to modern civilization that weren't being represented aren't not necessarily presented in the way that they should be. I'm thinking personally, I'm involved in a project of Lakota history, and where there's a richness of Lakota. I'm talking about the Lakota people tradition, which is not being presented in the courses. And so many traditionalists feel that what they have to offer modern civilization and what is not being presented in this framework that is supposedly helping them. So, I think this is another kind of double tragedy of the whole story.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you in the sense of restriction. So yeah, my remarks were really about trying to limit things, and part of that is in the interest of creating more debate. So I totally agree with Olga about the fact that we need more debate between different perspectives, but they need to be talking about the same thing in order to have a debate. And so part of that means I think we do need to limit somewhat the range of topics that we're discussing. I mean, I think one of the problems of the multiculturalist approach has been that, oh, well, we need to be looking at all different cultures. And I actually don't think we need to be looking at all different cultures, and not in terms of a general education curriculum, right? So I think we can distinguish between a general education curriculum and kind of the expanse of the university, I suppose. But certainly a general education curriculum, I do think needs to be limited to a certain extent to a certain canon. And that should be limited. We can talk about the ways in which which texts, which periods and which cultures should be included and how to do that. But I think there should be a kind of some kind of common core of texts around which debate can be organized, and within which you can have real debates between different perspectives on on specific issues. And so, by creating this hyper specialization and expanding the range of text to be studied, it diffuses that kind of debate. And then the other point about including all perspectives. I mean, actually, I don't think we need to be including all perspectives. I mean, one of the things, certainly nobody is arguing that we need to include, there's a history of Nazi racist organizations and perspectives on culture. Nobody is saying that we need to include those in our university curriculums. So in the sense that implicitly we do exclude certain aspects of certain perspectives, and we need to think about, well, what are our criteria for that type of exclusion? I mean, we're doing these exclusions, but I think right now the problem is that these exclusions are being extended to ideas like equal opportunity and colorblindness and merit, right? And those are being excluded now from our curricula, from university discourse, and that needs to be rethought. But that needs to be done in a context where we understand that exclusions are actually necessary in order for debate to occur, in order for for our universities to pursue a particular mission. So, okay, I just went a little too long, but.
No, well put. You didn't go too long. I wish you could go longer. I only wish we had more time for everyone to go longer. We have maybe time for 3 more questions if we go just maybe 5 minutes over, if the audience will bear with us. I don't mean to interrupt any thoughts that the other panelists have on this question, but Luis Barza asks a question for David. You made an observation that I thought was quite astute and one that I myself have had difficulty in explaining to others. Authoritative interventions to prevent bigotry often result in more bigotry. How do you explain how this process works on campuses or elsewhere?
So, I mean, I think the problem is basically defining a person through their belonging to a particular group. And so, I think that, the basic premise of affirmative action is to say, well, we're going to give special preferences to certain people because they belong to a certain group. And that's essentially a kind of stereotypical way. When it's based on race, it's a racist way of doing things. And so even if it's they're giving preferences to blacks, then there is a kind of implicit use of a kind of stereotype in order to make decisions on individuals. And that's the fundamental problem. And to the extent that we've kind of set this in stone through the DEI policies, but also through, I mean, I'm opposed really to, they have those, for federal forms, there's always this little survey where you have to write down or declare your ethnicity or your race and your gender. I mean, I think those should really be abolished. I mean, I don't think people should be judged based on that. There shouldn't be a criterion, right? If we don't want that to be, if we don't want racism, then we need to get rid of any kind of categorization based on race. And so I think the bigotry comes from the fact of labeling somebody based on their racial belonging, and that's what we need to get rid of. But unfortunately, affirmative action policies have just reinforced that tendency. So that's the problem I see. Thanks for the question.
Olga's hand is up and John is looking quizzical. Olga?
So I want to respond to the issue of the exclusion of some material versus others. I think in the field of history, which, I don't see, I'm personally in favor of doing world history. And I don't think, I think it helps in terms of the marketplace of ideas. And I don't think that how one builds, I think that values is more, if you want to build a curriculum around certain philosophy courses with values, but I think I'm not so much in favor of that in the field of history. But in relation to the exclusion, where what we're seeing how it's impacting Zionism is that the effort to make Zionism like Nazism is an effort, therefore, to make historians who are Zionist excluded. So just like we don't have Nazi histories of World War II, we don't study revisionist histories. We're not going to study Zionists who look at the history of Israel. So that's absolutely the playbook here. And not that I think we should now we should include revisionist Nazi histories of Nazism, but I think that I don't think we have a clear, I have an answer to it in that I think there's certain basic values, but it's hard to articulate just in terms of excluding certain histories or certain parts of the world. And I think it's something that has to be considered in a longer and more evaluated process. And maybe here I have a strong disagreement with the panel, but I think one of the wonderful things about history is that there is something to learn from different cultures, if only to learn why you disagree with them, meaning that their learning is not simply about agreeing, that sometimes in the encounter and the disagreement, something is strengthened. So I'm in favor of that. But what the other aspect of it seems the more left-wing or DEI is, rather than looking at the traditional viewpoints of various societies, it's been more focused on modern period or a period of victimization, et cetera. And so we don't get this encounter and clash and marketplace of ideas. We get more the recycling of this one model of settler colonialism or this one model of the bad parts of modernity, rather than the full richness of human experience.
So
Please.
My idea is not to exclude anything, but what I'm saying is that in order to have a particular mission at a university, and I think universities have to have missions, you have to have criteria for inclusion, I suppose, that extend beyond the fact that something hasn't been included before. So So certainly, I mean, I think that, the question that Gabi had posed before, well, what is what is so interesting about Lakota culture? That's a relevant question. It's not to say we're there's nothing. I have nothing. I don't want to exclude Lakota culture, but in order to include it, somebody needs to make the case for it, to say, oh, this is the value of studying this for us, particularly. And so it's not about saying, oh, there's this whole world of cultures out there and everything has to be studied. Of course, the university, nobody has the resources to study everything. And so we need to make choices about what to include. And we need to have a particular set of criteria with which we're going to be making those choices. And so that's the issue. So it's not, I mean, it goes back to these canon debates we had in the 80s about, well, how are you I remember I had a college roommate who said, I really want to get into the canon before it explodes. Well, it's exploded, right? And so, but we need to build it back. And so, but there needs to be some way of making decisions about this, not in order to exclude cultures, but really in order to say, well, what's relevant to us today, and why, what's the basis for studying this or that particular culture, not just because it's something that hasn't been studied before, or there are certainly things that we used to be reading that whatever that belong to Western culture that we maybe don't really mean it, not so urgent today. But in any case, that's the perspective I'm trying to work out of kind of I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
David, would you accept the fact that all that you just said indicates that exclusion was the wrong word for you to use in the first place? You didn't really mean that.
So,
I mean, in other words, there's a huge amount of stuff you could be studying out there.
Yes.
Huge amount of cultures. You make choices.
Yes.
You make choices given certain values.
Yes.
But you're not excluding anything. You're just not choosing it. That's all.
Well, yeah. So there is a sense in which I did want to use the word exclusion, and that is excluding certain values. So like I indicated, look, Nazi racism is certainly a value that we're going to exclude from the university as an organizing principle for research, right? And so that is an exclusion. Now, you're right.
Well, it's worth understanding those people because they've resurfaced in the Middle East. People with the same mentality. It is worth understanding. Look, I mean, I must confess that I'm pleased that finally one can get one's hands on Mein Kampf in German at last. It has been outlawed. Something people should understand.
But I'm trying to differentiate between a value system and specific texts and topics. I'm not interested in excluding any particular texts or topics. What I am interested in excluding is a certain research project, right, that would be organized around something like, spreading dangerous viruses. We're excluding that project as a research goal, right? And I think we're also excluding the project of promoting a kind of Nazi racism as a research goal. So there are two levels that we're talking about. One is the level of kind of the values and goals of the university, and the other is the level of specific texts and topics and right.
But you're not then excluding topics for study. You're excluding the illegitimate promotion of things. I mean, which is, exactly what the current left is all about. They're not about knowledge. They're not about understanding. They're about spreading out their ideas and making converts to them. That we can agree on. But not because we want to exclude some ideas, but because that's not the business of the academy. The academy's business is to study things, to understand things.
Yes, but but the difficulty, though, is that in studying things, you're always setting up a value system in studying. So I'm just going to go back to my medical example. I mean, obviously, you could have a university that's dedicated to producing and dangerous viruses that would wipe out sections of the world, right? And it's possible that there are research labs that do this. But I think that one of the things that we need to do is basically exclude that as a priority or as a mission from our universities of developing dangerous viruses, right? Or
I have a question from the audience. I have a question from the audience that fits your debate here perfectly.
Okay.
So let's get John Elliott involved. It seems to me, no offense, we've got Carl Schmitt versus, again, no offense, John Hagel. I know you wouldn't accept that. But John Elliott asks, I'm particularly interested, and I hope that others participating would also be, in hearing about what, and this is the topic you're on, I think, the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas impends or implies. Do the best ideas, people, perspectives command the best prices, or are there in fact many mini markets, some of them irrational, in quotes, such as the contemporary humanities and the Western University, that play by different rules? In other words, in what sense are the views of 1,000 influential academics that DEI programs are essential to the future of the American university, i.e. these command top price, reliable and convincing guidelines for what we should think and how we should act? Olga's had her hand up patiently, and I think this question just enriches the conversation you're already having. Olga.
Well, it used to be that universities were aligned by a certain religion. So you'd have a Catholic, university, you'd have a Protestant, and I think maybe that's sort of the model, which is there might be some courses that cover the text of the core value of that university, and then afterwards the faculties just cover the expanding knowledge, including the I would imagine then, because I'm focused here on history, that we would still have a history department that covers world history both geographically and chronologically, and because that's the objective of world is understanding humanity in various different times and places, and through that the student also gets some challenges to these courses that are being offered as, shall we call them civics courses, or shall we call them, whatever name we want to give them, what used to be, a kind of catechism in some way, to use a Christian term. I don't think that we need to see these two projects as incompatible. And I think that what is positive, I mean, you mentioned, Professor Penn, in your talk, that that the critiques of the left need to be responded. I don't want to lose I want to keep a dialectic. I want left and right fighting each other, debating. I want people doing social history clashing with people doing cultural history. I want to do a class on French history where the French Revolution, where I read the monograph by the Marxist scholar, by the cultural historian, by the social historian, etc. So I do want to learn about these other cultures. And when I finally finish my book project on the conversation between Jewish and Lakota culture, maybe you will be persuaded that there was something of value in reading that. But I put that out there, that maybe we just need a core curriculum, and each university chooses that, and that also corresponds to the marketplace of ideas question, which is maybe we also need a marketplace of universities. So different universities, and there the taxpayers can have their say. I think what Professor Ellis is talking about, that if in fact the taxpayers are paying for the public universities, then they may also be discussing what should be in the marketplace of those ideas, and what should be in the catechism of the university, in addition to the university's general objective of expanding our knowledge in different fields.
I just want to say I agree with Olga's suggestion. It's perfectly in line with what I'm thinking. Yes.
Could the panelists, as we wrap up the recorded portion, and then people can stick around if they like, could the panelists, or one panelist or another, please sum up how the ideas and structures dominant in universities today ground the response to the atrocities of October 7th? A few sentences from each, maybe, a pithy statement from each. We've been discussing things so fascinating. My mind is on fire. A few sentences from each of you.
I think the basic problem with the student protests, like in favor of Hamas against Israel, has been that they have taken over this sort of victim ideology, where anybody who's a victim is considered to be good, and there's no inquiry into the particular values and the particular ideologies that different parties represent, and so that I think directly comes from the sort of DEI policies that categorize people according to group belonging. It belongs very much to the multiculturalist agenda, in which you are valorizing certain cultures simply because they're there, and not because of any particular reason that we think that there's something valuable about them that we should be studying. And so again, I mean, I think that, I mean, you know, one of the difficulties is that there's this assumption that the Palestinians are somehow good because they're the victims, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, that was the case that was made by the Germans or the Nazis made about the Germans. We were the victims, and therefore, you know, there's something good about that. There's no particular reason to be validating victims just to be just about victims. There is an ideological conflict at stake in this battle between between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and that's something we need to fold onto. And clearly, I mean, in my mind, the Israelis are the ones that at this point are defending kind of the ideals of liberal democracy, of ultimately of human rights in their policies and in their procedures, whereas the Palestinians and Hamas in particular is just really opposing those types of values. So that's how I see the connection.
From where I sit, thank you, Dr. Penn. Dr. Kirschbaum-Shirazki, please, your thoughts, and then John Ellis will conclude the formal portion of these proceedings.
There are a number of historians, well-known historians, who have come out saying Israel might be committing genocide, etc. So if you have history faculties where you really have a multitude of worldviews, and where you have kind of this debate and you teach students that way, then students have the skills to look and evaluate what happened in a better way. And instead, you have when you have kind of a homogeneity of ideas, and so you have an increasing slide towards Zionism as Nazism or settler colonialism, an increasing slide of the history or the teaching of history of Zionism as critique, rather than including people who are aligned with it and see it as then that's an atmosphere which is raising a generation of young people who are idealistic and want to fight for something, and who have a kind of messianic fervor to be going into the streets. So I think that returning to history departments that are committed to debate and it's to some kind of skepticism about evidence and ideas and that kind of thing is the wider umbrella under which you can avoid this sort of mass groupthink and quite frankly, lack of critical engagement with the events, as Professor Penn said. I mean, people are they can name Netanyahu, but very few people can name the leaders of Hamas or name the leaders of Hezbollah or name, right? So they're just not asking the basic questions a historian would ask. Who are the actors? What are their ideologies? What are they doing? What have they done in the past? What are their strategies? So we're missing a massive amount of critical thinking that one might have if we had functioning history departments that had a dialectic.
Thank you, Olga. And as we wrap up the formal part of the event, and people are welcome to stay, I turn it over to John. What do you think about how all this really kind of fits with our concerns about October 7th?
The question, October 7th, the question is it a way of life for Israel, or is it just one event? Now, what I mean by that is, if I were the Israelis, I would say very publicly to the Palestinians, we don't need to go into Rafah. We don't need to carry on this war. There need not be any more damage to civilian life in Gaza. If you will simply tell us that this was a one-off and that you don't propose to do it again. If you propose to do it again, we have no choice but to tear Gaza to pieces to stop it. So the choice is up to you. Well, that's what I would say. Make it very public whose values are at stake, And if Hamas will not assure Israel that this is not a way of life they're facing, now there's many incidents like this they're facing. If they will not do that, then okay, they're basically agreeing to what Israel is going to do. They have a way of stopping it. They could promise that they will never do it again, and then everything would be fine. Now, we know basically that they won't ever promise not to do it again, but Israel must make it public that this is the issue. Tell us you won't do it again, we stop everything we're doing in Gaza.
Folks, you've all been brilliant tonight in my view. You've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure that's true for the audience. I can't thank you enough for these really great presentations and engaged thoughts with things that are academic in the literal sense, in the pejorative sense, and in the best sense, and way beyond academic, existential, political in the finest sense, and moral. And thank you very much. We're out of time for the formal proceedings, but don't go away if you're willing to or interested to stick around for a little more informal